So I'm in Pensacola. So we had fun this week with a hurricane. And there's more out in the Gulf we're watching. So let's hope for our little Gulf Coast areas that we don't get another one, because we're all pretty sick of it. And I'm trying to remember how many days of school my kids have missed at this point. 9, I think, due to the storms. We had Sally and now this last one, which I think Zeta, Hurricane Zeta. So anyway, we're going to talk about UDL this afternoon, and Universal Design for Learning is what UDL stands for. When you think about UDL, I'm just kind of curious what your background knowledge is. So if you could type in the chat box, if you have little or no knowledge, type a 1. If you have some knowledge, type a 2. And if you are very familiar with it, go ahead and type a 3. You can kind of gauge where people are at. Okay, looks like we have some 2s, a 1, and a 3. All right, sounds good. So we have quite the range. So I'll make sure to kind of give a little background as I go for folks that are unfamiliar with it, and then I'll try to go a little deeper with some of the concepts if you are familiar with it. So what we're doing today, we're going to talk about the framework itself, and I'm going to model use of a planning tool, and we're going to practice a little bit with the tool. So if you want to find a standard or 2 from your lessons this week or coming up, just try to jot that down out to the side, because you might want it to refer to later for the little practice part. And then go ahead and open up that UDL guidelines link there and have it open on your browser, because we're going to refer to that. It's just easier if we have it open to start with. And then something to kind of jot down some notes to yourself.
Can you put the link in the chat?
Sure. Hold on. Now this, and I'll copy it. Oh, thanks, Amy. And Amy's been hosting all day, so she is the bomb. Okay, so to start out, what we're going to talk about, UDL is sometimes considered a special education concept, even though it's not really. But one of the reasons why it's highlighted as a special education concept is that we have students with disabilities in our general education classrooms quite a bit, 80% of the time. For their instruction for many students with disabilities happens in the general education classroom, and science is one of the places they tend to start out in before they go to reading and math. But when we look at their performance on any type of assessment, whether it's state, national, or international, they consistently have much lower levels of proficiency in science, as well as some of the other subjects. When we think about how teachers are prepared to teach students with disabilities in science, most teachers and even their faculty that taught them in their methods classes report they have pretty limited preparation for teaching students with disabilities. You kind of get just the general suggestions, make sure you use things like graphic organizers and maybe some guided notes, and that's maybe about all that you were told about teaching with students with disabilities. Or even more helpful suggestion, just go find that special education teacher at your school, and they'll tell you exactly what you need to do. The national standards, which are the NGSS, Next Generation Science Standards, propose that universal design for learning would be a suitable approach for helping teach all students, and especially those with disabilities. This approach is a proactive approach. So when you're thinking about planning your curriculum, you're trying to think about ways of adjusting your curriculum to improve access and learning for all students. And the focus is not on how to fix students, it's how to adjust your curriculum. So if you look at the little cartoon and read the captions there, the idea is if you put your efforts towards clearing off the ramp, then everybody will be able to access learning, versus trying to do individual things for different students all the time. And some of those things might be needed because you have an IEP that states that, but if you adjust your instruction in certain ways, it can be helpful for many students, not just those with disabilities. When we think about teaching science, there's a whole lot of potential learning barriers that can come into play. So one of the most common ones is, lack of background knowledge, because we have students from all different kinds of backgrounds. They may not have had some informal science learning experiences, or they may have many informal science learning experiences before they came to school. The vocabulary can be very complex and overwhelming. It's almost like learning a second language. The reading level of text is often quite advanced, even though if it's considered on grade level, it may not really be grade level text. Other skills relating to rewriting and math come into play. And then there's something called executive functioning. That may be a new term for you. So I'm just going to show you this little document. We're going to come back to this at the end. But if you've never heard of this term, it's related to your working memory, how well you can think about things and be flexible. And it's a lot about focus and planning on what you're going to do if you're given, say, a science fair project, or if you're given some type of investigation to carry out or a project to do. Those skills related to executive function often are a barrier for students, not just those with a disability or ADHD, but some students just really struggle with being able to plan and move forward with a project. And the last one is inductive and deductive reasoning skills. We focus on a lot of those in science because we ask students to make inferences. We ask them to draw conclusions from data. We ask them to propose hypotheses. And those skills sometimes are a little bit tricky for some students. When you look at the UDL framework, probably if you went to any basic training, they talked about the 3 principles. So engagement, representation, action, expression are the 3 principles. Engagement's related to how student motivation for learning is supported. And it's not just their interest at the beginning of the lesson, it's also how their motivation is supported during the lesson so they don't become overly frustrated and disengage. Representation is about how the teachers present their content in multiple ways, not just in text or not just in visuals, but you're trying to ensure comprehension of important concepts and that they can transfer those concepts to new types of tasks. And action expression has to do with how students communicate or demonstrate their understanding, so that we aren't just requiring them in science to constantly write out their answers, that they're able to represent their understanding in different ways. So this is the UDL framework graphic that you'll find at that website that I had you open. So if you go to this CAS website over here and you click on the upper right corner, it's an interactive tool. So all these things are hot linked, so you can click on them and read more information. We'll come back to that in just a moment. But just to give you a little overview, we have the 3 principles, like I mentioned before, with the pink arrows. But then under each principle, there are 3 guidelines. That's where I put the stars at. So 1, 2, 3 under engagement. 1, 2, 3 under representation. 1, 2, 3 under action expression, for a total of 9 guidelines. Then under each guideline, there are some bullet points. So you might have to zoom in and look at those, but there are some bullet points. Those are called checkpoints. And these are, the best way to describe them are general strategies for adjusting your instruction related to that principle and that guideline. The nice thing about the UDL website is that it does have that interactive tool, because very quickly you'll find this framework has a lot in it. And the more you spend with it, the more time you spend reading the information, the more you'll learn about the different strategies. But the best way to do that is to spend some time kind of exploring it. So for example, if I look at under engagement and I'm looking at how to recruit interests, maybe I'm curious about this checkpoint here that says minimize threats and distractions. I can click on it and it opens a new window. There'll be an explanation about why it's important. And there'll also be some suggestions about how to reduce threats and distractions. So some of them are kind of general, create an accepting and supportive classroom environment. Other ones might be a little bit more specific. So you'll see vary the level of novelty or risk, and they have some very specific things related to that. So all of the checkpoints will have this kind of setup where they have a explanation and they have some suggestions for strategies. When you're thinking about using UDL in your planning, the one thing that they always suggest is to be really clear about your learning goal for the lesson. So hopefully you're pretty good about looking at your standards and identifying what's the most important concepts and skills in your standard. So your learning goal needs to be related to that. Now in science, our concepts and our skills are going to be very specific to science, but sometimes people have a goal that mixes up science with, say, literacy. So I remember when I was writing lesson plans, and I would write things like students will explain whatever the concept is in a paragraph with no more than less 4 sentences, something like that. The problem with that kind of learning goal is that it mixes up the science with literacy. You have students that might be struggling writers and are not so good about spelling and grammar and all that good stuff, but you are limiting them by doing that, requiring that written expression in a paragraph. So think about that when you're writing your learning goal, that you want to be very careful that you're not limiting the mode of expression when you're writing it. You're just focusing on the science. Then you want to think about your students. You want to think about how the 25 or 30 kids in your class might differ in their prior experience and their interests, their knowledge and skills that are relevant to that learning goal that you're trying to teach. Once you've done that, you'll hopefully come up with a few different learning barriers that you might be able to address. Now, you can sit and probably jot down a very long list. I want you to think of maybe the most important learning barriers, the things that are really going to hold up kids in your lesson. And then you're going to pick strategies or solutions based upon the principles, guidelines, and checkpoints. So I'm going to model how to do this first, and then I'm going to have you practice a little bit. So here's a 3rd grade standard. Take a moment to look at it. It's about stars. And thinking about a class of 3rd graders, how they might differ in experience, interests, knowledge, and skills. What might be some learning barriers? Just type a couple ideas in the chat box. What might be difficult for them in a lesson about this? I'm going to stop my sharing just for a second because my chat box is not showing up for me very good. Let's try this. There I go. I can see it now. Okay, so Angela typed, some students may live where fewer stars are visible due to light pollution. And that's very true if you live in a city. So maybe in unsafe neighborhoods, so they're not really allowed to go outside after dark to do some sky gazing. Now let me describe a pretty typical lesson that I see in elementary science, unfortunately. The teacher might show a video about stars. The kids might read something from the textbook about stars, and they might write something in their science notebook about stars, just to give you a basic lesson script to work with. What might be challenges in that type of lesson for students? Give you 10 more seconds to type something else in the chat box. So Angela wrote, difficulty describing stars in a written format or challenges with written language. It's very true. In third grade, that's the grade where kids are moving from learning to read to reading to learn. So that would be perhaps another challenge as well, having them read the textbook, which is written at a third grade level, and you have kids that may still be at a kindergarten or first grade reading level. So keeping that in mind. All right, so I'm going to start my screen share again. Let's hope that I can still see the chat bar this time. Okay, so here's a couple things that you've already mentioned. You might have realized that some students may not have background experience stargazing, whether that's because of the light pollution or because their neighborhoods are unsafe and they can't go outside after dark, or they might have difficulty writing complete explanations in their science notebooks. So when I'm using a planning tool, those are the learning barriers I'm going to model how to navigate. So the first one, students may not have background experience stargazing. Now, when I'm thinking about that, I'm thinking that's going to be something related to their understanding, their comprehension. So as a teacher, what do I have to do related to that? I went ahead and linked the representation principle, because if you have issues with students' comprehension, then you're going to go to what the teacher is doing to teach the concept. It's kind of logical there. So when you read the representation principle here, it starts out, learners differ in the ways that they perceive and comprehend information that's presented to them. And that it says there is not one means of representation that will be optimal for all learners. So when you scroll down, you'll start looking at the guidelines. So the first guideline is about perception, being able to perceive information in a single mode. The next one is about language and symbols. Vocabulary is big in that one. And then the last guideline is comprehension. And when I go here and I look at comprehension, the checkpoint that stands out to me is this one about activate or supply background knowledge. So if kids are learning about stars and they have no experience looking at the sky and realizing what the stars look like at night, then I need to do something as a teacher to either activate or supply that background knowledge. And in this case, I'm going to supply the background knowledge so that everybody has the same place, the same background knowledge they can refer back to when they're learning. So a couple solutions that are related to teaching that particular information would be, I need to provide some type of virtual experience for them in the classroom. So a couple ways I could do that, I could either show a time-lapse video, not a teaching video, not an instructional video that explains all about stars, because there's lots of those out there, but an actual video that shows what the night sky looks like. Or I could maybe have some planetarium software I could put up on the smart board or whatever projector system you're using and manipulate that with the students. If I didn't want to use technology or don't have good technology in my classroom, I could get out those little sticky star things that you stick and glow in the dark and put them on top of my classroom ceiling. We get to do a little virtual observation that way. Or I could make a little homemade projector, perhaps with a shoebox and some craft paper, and poke some holes in it and put a flashlight in it so that we can pretend that we're looking at the sky to notice that some stars look a little bigger than others and start talking about why that might be. So these are all different solutions related to my curriculum. Remember, you're trying to look at your learning barrier and think first, well, which principle would address that logically? Once you have the principle down, then you can look at the options for the guidelines and checkpoints for that principle. So here's another example. So something else you mentioned, students may have difficulty writing their complete explanations in their science notebooks for various reasons. When students have to express their learning in some way, that is the second principle, action and expression. So I'm going to click on that one. And it provides an explanation here. Learners differ in the ways they can navigate the learning environment and express what they know. There's not one means of action expression that will be optimal for all learners. So providing options is essential. So I'm going to scroll down. I'm going to look at the 3 guidelines. The first one is about physical action. This has to do a lot with assistive technology. The next one is expression and communication. This is that students are composing and sharing their ideas using tools. That one's possible. And then the last one is executive functions, developing and acting on plans to make the most of learning. So out of those three guidelines, I think that second one sounds the most likely. So then I would look at the checkpoints for my options. So checkpoint 5.1 is using multiple media for communication. Let's look at that one real quick. So multiple media means text, speech, drawing, illustrations, comics, storyboards, etc. Social media, interactive web tools. Those are some of the examples they give. Maybe that's not what exactly I have in mind. Maybe I really want them to use that science notebook. So what can I do then? Then we have multiple tools for construction and composition. So this one is about providing tools to support students in completing something, some type of communication. So spell checkers, grammar checkers, text-to-speech software, story webs, outlining tools, concept mapping tools, different web applications to help them compose or create something. This one is looking pretty good. And then the last one, build fluencies with graduated levels of support for practice and performance. This is kind of a neat one, but I'm not sure if this is what I'm thinking here, because this is when you provide different models for students of what their writing should look like, and different scaffolds. So embedding different tools for them to use and select from. But let's think about that tools idea more. The second one. I think what I'm going to go with here is this idea of providing text-to-speech software and providing some support for how they can provide some communication. So that's why I picked 5.2. And here's a couple options. So the technology one is the speech-to-text feature in Google Docs or Slides to compose their entries. If I don't have any technology, then maybe I'm just going to go ahead and provide some send starters for student notebook entries. So send starters are things like, I think, and you leave a blank, because I saw, and then you leave a blank. So it's giving them that structure of a sentence, but then they're filling in the rest of their thinking. If it's in science, the spelling should not matter as much. So you generally tell students spell it the best you can. If you want to provide another tool, you can provide a dictionary or thesaurus, but the idea in science generally is that they're doing the best they can with their written language. So the sentence starter might help them be a little bit more complete in what they're writing. So that's how we would address two potential learning barriers, one related to representation and the other related to action and expression. Now, a third learning barrier might be related to just kids are not that interested in stars. Who wants to learn about stars? So then you would go explore the engagement principle. So that's just a tip for you to think about when we get to this next part. So you're going to try this now because I've been talking long enough. I want you to think about a science standard for your grade level and think about your students. What's some variability in terms of their prior experience, knowledge, skills? And I want you to think about what are some potential learning barriers related to that particular standard. And I know you guys are from different grade levels, so when you're ready to share out, I want you to give us kind of a synopsis of your learning goal. And it can be the exact standard language if you want, if you don't want to have to think too hard on a Friday afternoon. But then also what is going to be challenging for your students? What's the learning barrier that's related to that? So I'm going to give you guys about a 2-minute time period to jot down some ideas, and then I'm going to call on some people and see if we're awake on Friday afternoon. And when you're ready, you can just type in the chat box ready. All right, Angela's ready. Amy's saying that her kids get overwhelmed by science fair projects. Yes, they definitely do. And executive function is a great place to look at. Danielle has thermal energy and representation language of how they use that term. Heat, thermal, temperature, they're all very different from how we use them in everyday language. About 30 more seconds. Okay, so we have Danielle and Angela sharing, or sorry, Danielle and Amy sharing. Angela, what'd you have? And Susan shared one. Go ahead and type what you have.
You want me to type it?
Yeah, you can go ahead and type it. I'm just trying to see what people have out here. Okay, so hopefully everybody shared that want to share. A lot of it looks like we have language. We have problems with students being able to plan large projects. We have mathematical representations. That's a good one. Here's another one related relationships on graphs. So we're going to take a look at some of the places I need to look in just a second. I'm going to drive a little bit on the UDL website. So let me go back to the main website. So when you're thinking about matching up your learning barrier to the principal, it sounds like most of you are in either representation or action and expression. So if you have anything that's related to language and symbols, symbols includes math. So if you're looking in that section, that's where you need to investigate in just a moment. If you are looking at issues with students being able to complete a long-term project of some kind, such as science fair, then executive function is where you want to look, and that's under action and expression. Background knowledge and understanding language are two different things. They're going to be under, if it's language like vocabulary, then it's going to be under the guidelines for language and symbols. If it's comprehension and background knowledge, that's going to be down here. And let me see if there's anything else. I'm scanning through what you guys have put. I think that's it. Nobody really mentioned anything that's related to engagement explicitly. But if you have kids that give up, that they start a project and it's not an issue related to their executive function, it's more an issue related to them giving up, then you want to also look at not just executive function, but you want to look at self-regulation. So personal coping skills and strategies, and doing some self-assessment sometimes, making sure they use their coping skills. So that's where you would look in that case. Okay. So you're going to practice now using the UDL planning tool for your learning barrier that you identified. I gave you a little bit of guidance. So you're going to put your learning barrier down on your paper, draw a little chart, and then identify the principle, whether it's engagement, representation, or action expression, and investigate the guidelines and checkpoints for that. Read the information that's listed, and then you can come up with a solution or two based upon that explanation. Remember, the explanations are going to be kind of general, so you're going to have to relate them to that particular lesson about something you could do. So when you're reading through the information they have there, hopefully when you see it, you'll think of, okay, that's how I could apply this in science. This is how it's going to apply in science and this lesson in particular. So I'm going to give you guys about 2 minutes to do that. And then we're going to share out some of the information that we have. And this time we're going to do it verbally. So be ready for you to share your principle and your guideline checkpoint and your solution. When you're ready, go ahead and type ready in the chat box. And if anybody needs any help, you can ask for help and I'll navigate it with you. Danielle's ready. Angela's ready. About 30 more seconds. Wrap up where you're at. And I'm going to go to the UDL page just to get ready because I'm going to walk through as I call on a couple people. Amy's ready. All right, Danielle, I'm going to ask you first if you could go ahead and turn your mic on and share first your learning barrier and then tell us what you're thinking in terms of principle, guideline, checkpoint, and what your solution you came up with.
So I chose the standard dealing with thermal energy and, as I pointed out, the vocabulary using terms like heat, temperature, what a thermometer actually measures, those pieces. So I chose representation. And then underneath representation, my checkpoint was clarifying vocabulary and symbols.
Okay.
And I think one of the things that really helps students with this and understanding the difference between those terms and their nuances in science is providing graphic symbols or alternative text descriptions. But I think the visuals help them a lot more in understanding it, especially since our standard is understanding which way that energy is moving.
I actually had a high school teacher that did an awesome job with this. We had to do, he called them pictograms for our vocabulary. And so we had basically a visual dictionary of a lot of our vocabulary. And we made up a lot of the graphics. So it was a collaborative effort. So you could have, if you could split it up among students, like in a group, you could do it that way, or you could have like a running list of things that you're adding in your room of like a visual dictionary for important science terms. The other part of this that's helpful too sometimes is talking about what it means and what the examples and non-examples are. So it's this, but it's not that. So that can help as well. So that sounds like a great suggestion for what you have. All right, I'm going to ask one other person to share. Angela, how do you feel? Ready to share?
Yeah, except I pretty much picked the same category that Danielle did. I also picked the symbols and the symbols and expression. But
what did you pick for your solution though? You might have a different solution. You probably have a different solution though.
Yeah, so my standard that I picked was nature of science. I've taught middle school and high school before, and I think in general they have a really difficult time doing the nature of science questions. And both from the receptive side and so I'll go ahead and take it from the action and expression side rather than the representation side.
Oh, okay. So you actually using the vocabulary.
Right. I was going to do representation, but since Danielle covered that, sometimes the kids have a hard time expressing what they're seeing. So again, those sentence starters are usually a really great way to get them started, to prompt them to describe the relationships they're seeing, both on graphs, and then also if they're doing some sort of inquiry and they need to describe what they see, I often will ask them to describe it in their own words, and then maybe match it up to pictures so that they're building on that language skill, and they feel that the way that they see things is valid. Right.
And that's real important because it's not, they might have the conceptual understanding, but learning science is like learning another language. So the more support you can give them and using that language. So if they have, if you use sensors, but then you have some type of dictionary to go along with it, they can go back to and reference, that's sometimes helpful. I know their textbooks have the glossary in the back of the book and kids hate using that. But sometimes it is helpful. Or if they have an adaptive, they make their own glossary, sometimes it can be helpful, where you have just the most important words, not all 10,000 that are in the back of the book.
Yeah, since I took a UDL class as a part of my master's, and one of the things I started doing this year because of that is I always build the notes that we do and then build the practice with the students of looking back to their notes whenever struggle, because at least in my experience, the high school kids I see, they write down notes and they have no idea what to do with them. So
they don't know how to study.
We take our note taking very short, and anytime they're not sure, my answer is always look back in your notes. Look back in your notes.
The other part of that is that executive function piece. So when you're having students, they have this information that you have had them take and note taking, but getting them to manage it. And checklists and guides for note taking are very helpful, but then teaching them how to go back and maybe do something with their notes. So writing a summary for their notes, or going through and then identifying important things from their notes. Any type of practice interacting with the notes is helpful. It's not just the actual act of note taking. Because if you are a good studier, you don't just stare at your notes and it magically goes in your head. So you have to do something with them oftentimes to get them really to actively process that information. All right, so we have two great examples. Do we want to have a third? Does anybody want to volunteer that picked a little something different? I'm gonna pick Amy because she said she had kids struggling with science fair projects.
So I did, like I said, I have a lot of gifted students and the executive functioning skills are just not there sometimes. So I did action expression, executive function. And then for checkpoint 6.2, it's about planning and strategies. And it talks about having coaches and mentors model think aloud of the process, and then breaking the long-term goals into shorter ones. So having somebody maybe in the older grades that have already done it, like say, you do this first, and then I'm going to do this, and then I'm going to do this, but I'm going to start here. And then, showing how they use their checklist or, their schedules to kind of keep on track. So,
yeah, that's a great idea. And kids sometimes listen to each other better than us. I know that's no shock, right? So if they have a peer that's in another grade level, or even a peer at their own grade level that can provide some mentoring or coaching on that process. Sometimes if you assign coaches that in your class, you don't have the opportunity to go to a different class or have kids from another grade level come in, you can have them coach each other too. So you have to model that, how that looks. You can do a check-in, like let's check in with our peers about how our science fair project is going, and give them 15 minutes to check in. Well, what have you gotten done this week? What do you need to do next week? Just so they're moving through the process, and then they have a little bit of accountability buddy that will keep them honest, hopefully, and not procrastinating. All right, guys, it sounds like you have some great ideas with using that type of planning tool. So we went through and shared some of our solutions. Now, if you just want to spend a moment, and I know it's Friday afternoon, so by Monday, all this is going to evaporate out of your head. So I want you to write yourself a note. So 3 things that you learned about using UDL in general or in science. 2 things you wonder, so some questions you have. And 1 thing you will try out in your classroom in the next coming weeks. I'll give you about a minute. When you're ready, type ready in the chat box. Whenever you're ready, type ready in the chat box. Danielle's ready, Angela's ready. Maggie's ready. Let's see, Maureen and Mark, are you still with us? And Susan?
Yes, I'm here. I have a problem with the communication, so that's why.
Oh, okay. I just want to make sure I'm not leaving anybody.
Yeah, I have the internet in and out, so that's why I have to be out, in, and then that's what the problem.
I see. Okay.
I'm sorry about that.
No, I just want to make sure everybody's with me.
Yes, I'm here.
Okay, sounds good. All right, so now's the time to ask a question. See, I even made you write them down, so I know people have them. So what are a couple questions we'd like to discuss? We probably have time for 2 or 3 at least. Whenever you're ready, you can just go ahead and go on the audio and ask.
I'm curious if you have any direction to provide on those executive functioning skills, because I even have, my kids are ADHD, and the lists that I have, they don't necessarily help my students. So is there something good you recommend for the middle and high school level in terms of a resource?
The middle and high school level, a lot of it is teaching them how to use the list. So you give them a checklist, right? Is that what you're saying?
Yes, I give them very detailed descriptions right now
Mm-hmm.
in Google Classroom of exactly what they need to turn in.
Mm-hmm.
And apparently I'm
Getting-
not speaking the correct language because they still don't check them.
Getting them to interact with it might be part of the problem. So you might need to take 5 minutes in the beginning of your day, once a week or twice a week, to have them go, okay, check off what you've gotten done since last time. Make a plan. What are you going to do this afternoon? It has to be that specific sometimes, because it's not like when we go to the grocery store that we go check off all those things. They've never really interacted with checklists very much before. So getting them to actually use them might be part of the issue. So you have to give some dedicated time and model how to do that. And then, like I said, maybe having a buddy in the class helps, because they can check in with each other. And then you can remind them, make sure you check in with your buddy later this week about where you are with your project or whatever with your work this week. So teaching them explicitly how to use the checklist might be part of it.
All right, perfect. Thank you.
You're welcome. I'm going to turn my light on. I didn't realize it got quite that dark in here. Hold on 1 second.
So what's another question that anybody has? Oh, it looks like Maggie has typed something in the. So have you ever assisted any informal educators helping to implement this? So you mean like museum educators, that kind of thing, Maggie? Okay. So a lot with museum education, I actually did my dissertation in a museum, so I'm familiar with it. That has to do more about representation many times. So you guys don't assign work and have to collect it, so that's at least nice in terms of the action expression thing. But representation, you have to remember, it's not that we all have different learning styles, it's that some concepts are better communicated in a visual format versus a verbal format. So the example that I give my students sometimes when I'm teaching my science methods class is when I'm talking about cells. And I start reading off a list of all the cell parts and explaining what the different parts are. And I get about 5 cell parts in, 5 organelles down the list, and I see the blank looks. And I say, okay, so let's put up a graphic. And now I'm going to talk you through these different cell parts of what they do. That visual helps. So anytime when you're trying to provide an explanation, try to provide not just the auditory information, but the visual to go along with it. And if you can do kinesthetic type things that help them make some connections to what you're talking about, if it's a process, that can be helpful as well. So the more modes of representation you can use, the better to get that concept across. Hopefully that helps a little bit. And then Susan asked about a self-regulatory goal for the reduction of aggressive frustration outbursts. That is very difficult to do, but it is related to, let me pull up the engagement principle. So when you look at engagement, you're going to look at self-regulation, and in terms of coping skills and strategies and self-assessment and reflection, those two usually go together. So let me pull up the self-reflection. You can have a sticky note on a desk, and just as a student is saying something, doing something like pushing on the desk, some type of frustrated behavior, you can just kind of quietly tally those behaviors. And when they're calm, don't do it when they're upset, because nobody wants to talk about anything when they're upset. That's just kind of the rule of thumb with people being upset. They can't think and they can't talk very clearly. Wait till they're calm and talk to them and say, you know, we had 20 minutes here where you had some kind of outburst or something was going on physically, and this is how many times it happened. What can we do that tomorrow it's going to be this many times less? So that's how you set a goal, is you talk about some actual evidence that you can show them. You just don't say, well, yesterday you did this and it was very disruptive and I don't want you to do that anymore. Kids can't go from having outbursts and negative behaviors to zero overnight. So you have to gradually set goals and reduce that over time. The other part that goes along with this is the coping skills. For whatever reason, they don't have any coping skills sometimes when they get to us. And so you have to teach coping skills. You teach breathing, you teach body awareness. So how your muscles feel, are you feeling very tense? And what do you do to relax them? So you teach them some tensing and relaxing motions. And sometimes you teach visual imagery or how to take a timeout. They put themselves in timeout basically. So you have a place in the classroom where they can calm down, put some headphones, listen to music for 5 minutes, rejoin the class after they're calm. So you have to teach not only the coping skills part, but setting a goal and getting them to use the coping skills and monitoring it and showing them you're making progress. Look how good you did. Yesterday we had this, today it was this many. And some people provide incentives for good behavior. I know some schools have PBIS, but it's much more effective that you're actually teaching them and talking to them, not just you're going to get a prize out of the box because you were a good kid. So that would be my recommendation about the goals and strategies related to self-regulation. Yeah, the fish tank. Kids love fish tanks and lava lamps and all kinds of things that they can watch and kind of chill out for a minute. And it's not so much important that they get into the reason why they're freaking out, but it's just teaching them to calm down. It takes time. Okay, so just some resources for you guys. Where time is almost up. It looks like these are some resources for further learning. So the first two are articles from understood.org. The second two are videos, so those might be helpful. And the last one I found, I picked because it had some distance learning tips. And I know a lot of people are dealing with that right now. So you can use those later on and look through them maybe. Let's see, link to slides in the chat. Yeah, I can, that'd be great, Amy, if you could put those for me. And then if you need my email, there it is. If you have any questions down the road, if you like to read research, I have research articles you can read also. So there's some stuff on there. So that's all I have this evening. Does anybody have any final questions or comments? Let me see if I can copy these and put these in the chat. Oh. They are actually hot links. So let me go ahead and put these individually. Sorry, I'm talking about these resources. So I'm going to go ahead and put the links individually for these. And I actually have them all open. Looks like, so there's the executive function. There's that. And then here's the last one. This last one I watched today, it was pretty good. It was a whole webinar about a teacher trying some different things out in the classroom. So I thought it was really interesting. So if you'd like some more specific examples, I think that's a good one.
All right, make sure you copy those down so that way.
Right, there you go. So those are the 2 articles and the 2 videos. And like I said, the last one has real specifics about how a teacher used UDL in her classroom. So that was a nice one to share. And I think that's about it. That's all my time.
Thank you so much. That was wonderful. And I always learn something new. So now I took away the
My audio was off. Let me put it back up.
There's 1 serving per can. So what would our total
Let
amount
me turn
be?
that off.
What would our total gram?
Sorry, Amy, were you saying something? I didn't catch it.
Say thank you. This is awesome. So, all right. I'm going to go ahead and stop recording.